Back in 1982, a Disney film came out and off I went to the cinema to see it. This is the Regal in Melton Mowbray, a single-screen market-town cinema that in those days had the kind of seats that were, to say the least, rather unforgiving for anything over 90 minutes. The seats still had ashtrays built in and nowhere to put your cup. I also saw The Empire Strikes Back there. It was the place I first saw The Exorcist before you were allowed to see it in your home. Tron was one of those moments that sealed my love for films right here in this wonderful little cinema. And it's one of the few Disney films that I look back on with absolute love and awe. Why do I mention all of this? Well, it's because it's nostalgia. And that's a big part of what this film is, what it's about, why it means so much. But let's have a look at the film itself. I had no idea what it took to put this film together at the time, but it was different. It was mind-boggling, eye-popping. It tapped into the fantasies of the burgeoning computer scene and drew upon my love for arcade games, which was the only reason to go to the seaside for me at that age. It was quite alluring. The original Tron, by comparison to its production process, and more of that in a few minutes, is a very simple story. Opening to the attempts of Kevin Flynn fighting to gain access to his former company Encom's Master Control Program, the MCP, in order to find proof of the company's theft of his games, he's frustrated by the powerful and intelligent software.
Hello, Mr. Dillinger. Thanks for coming back early.
No problem, Master C. If you've seen one consumer electronics show, you've seen them all. What's up?
It's your friend, the boy detective. He's nosing around again.
Flynn?
Yes? It felt like Flynn.
You're still looking for that old file. Can't you just appropriate it?
I have. I put it in my memory, which he hasn't located.
But he might find it.
I'm afraid so. I spotted him this time and kept him out, but he's getting trickier all the time.
I think we should shut down all access until we find that Flynn, just to be safe.
There's a 68.71% chance you're right.
Cute.
End of line.
Meanwhile, in Encom, a battle is going on between the employees and former workmates Alan and Laura, and the Encom Vice President Dillinger for control of the systems that they use, with the MCP blocking access to key programs under the excuse of security. Alan's own security program, Tron, has been restricted without reason being given, but the MCP has done it to protect itself from Tron's purpose of monitoring system activity. The MCP has been up to dubious things and blackmails Dillinger with information about his appropriation of Flynn's work. Teaming up with Alan and Laura, now disenchanted with their situation, Flynn breaks into Encom to get to the system at its source, but is dragged into the computer world by the MCP via their digitizing laser system. Once he's there, he's forced into battling on the grid in gladiatorial games that could result in his destruction. But in the computer world, he finds his friends' avatars, programs designed by them to mirror the real world, and forging an alliance with them, he has to battle his way to the MCP in order to shut it down, and return to the real world. But a lot lays between him and the monster that he has to take down.
Okay, here's an easy one.
Finish the game!
No!
Kill him!
No!
You'll regret this.
I want him in the games until he dies playing.
Seven years later, and Tron Legacy picks up the story, as Flynn, now the Encom CEO, puts his son to bed with a story of his adventures before disappearing for years. 20 years later, the son, Sam, despite being the biggest shareholder of Encom, doesn't have much interest on being part of the company outside of messing with them occasionally, with pranks like releasing the company's brand new premium software to the mercy of the internet. When he's released by the police for his latest stunt, Sam gets a visit from Alan Bradley, his guardian, and Flynn's friend from the days of Tron, who tells Sam that he's received a page from Flynn's old arcade. Alan encourages him to go over and have a look. Curiosity gets the better of him, and he opens up the abandoned building that's been shut down for what seems like a very long time. Finding a secret entrance into the basement, he discovers the MCP console down there, along with some other very familiar machinery. When he fires up the old console, the machine starts up and drags him into the computer world, where Sam is captured and forced to fight for his life on the grid. After he survives a series of battles and nearly escapes, Sam's confronted by Clue, the program his father created to make a perfect world, who also resembles him from back in the 80s. Clue decides to go up against him on the light cycle grid, and when things start taking a turn against Sam, he's saved by Quora, a program that turns out to be an ISO, an independently thinking program that has unusual properties, not being restricted to normal duties, but more capable of abstract and problem-solving thinking. She takes Sam to meet his father, who tells him about Clue's rise to power and his war against those he sees as aberrations in the computer world, with Tron apparently dead and Quora being the last of the ISOs. Father and son resolve to escape the computer world, but the path between them and the portal is very long and dangerous, with duplicitous programs to deal with and an army of enemies to defeat, not least the powerful and ambitious Clue.
Hang on, buddy, I'm coming! Come on!
My feelings towards the original Tron are conflicted somewhat. Fair warning, some of this will sound like I'm beating on the film, and in my opinion there is plenty to justify that, but bear with me. Tron is a huge part of why I appreciate filmmaking. We'll get to that soon enough, but I have a conflict because, frankly, well, the story isn't very good. The things that I do appreciate about the story are the human struggle aspect, the battle for justice, and of course the reflection of what the characters in the real world are going through. Though considering the real-world story is largely about circumventing the annoying security of a corporation and a copyright battle, how very ironic, Disney, it's a thin and largely unemotional background upon which to rest the drama. Couple that with a rather stilted plot progression that feels more like bullet points on a plot synopsis than it does a flowing narrative, and I can't help but feel a bit unemotional about the story itself. It's clunky, to say the least. Flynn, upon being sucked into the computer world, is almost immediately fully capable, and there's very little learning process before he becomes supremely capable, to the point of being something of a Mary Sue, which barely stops short of the narrative crime by virtue of the fact that he needs his friends to win the day. Oddly though, Flynn stands out far more prominently than the titular character of Tron. He's a strangely placed character in the story. He's the POV for the most part, and more prominent as a hero character than the guy that's supposed to be the hero, at least according to the title. So from there we lurch from plot point to plot point in an ironically digital way, with very little character building along the way. I love this movie, but the story is terrible, and it's very, very weak in its execution. I think I even knew it to some extent back then. What Tron is actually an event. It's a trip into pure fantasy, and it's breathtaking. And it's also something that will largely diminish with the younger that you are. Tron is one of those films that is perfectly of its time. I don't often use the word zeitgeist, but it fits here. The computer world was opening up to the everyday man and woman. We had game systems and computers coming into our homes. Ordinary kids were creating their own little worlds within these little boxes of electronics, where their imagination was only limited by the capability of the hardware. Wonderful things were happening. Exciting stories and epic battles were explored, and fantasies and dreams were inspired by and realised in the digital medium. Thematically, there's a strong man and god subtext, and the religious overtones are paralleled in the corporate structure of Encom. But there's further to this, the battle of the powerful man against these gods. Flynn himself is brought from the realm of the user to the world of the program, a literal fall from which he has to return with the help of his friends, and his friends' creations in the computer world, and his nature is seen by the computer world as being something akin to that of a god. The MCP, however, is the equivalent of a CEO in the real world, and he wants more power, and he has no respect for his user. He's the one that rejects the authority of his god and acts with astounding hubris to control and coerce Dillinger, the man who thinks he's the MCP's user.
My fault. I programmed you to want too much.
I was planning to hit the Pentagon next week.
The Pentagon?
It shouldn't be any harder than any other big company, but now this is what I get for using humans.
Now, wait a minute. I wrote you.
I've gotten 2,415 times smarter since then.
What do you want with the Pentagon?
The same thing I want with the Kremlin. I'm bored with corporations. With the information I can access, I can run things 900 to 1,200 times better than any human.
If you think you're superior to us...
You wouldn't want me to dig up Flynn's file and read it up on a VDT at the Times, would you?
You wouldn't dare.
In the real world, the MCP is clearly becoming more controlling and acts independently of Dillinger to control the digital realm without Dillinger's consent. Flynn has his own selfish reasons for manipulating the digital world. He's trying to correct a wrong committed against him. But he takes a journey from using the programs as merely tools for his purpose to connecting with them as beings he can and should care about, to the point that he shifts his perspective of his own status of user to that of program. Returning to the character of Tron though, we can see a serious structural problem in the hierarchy of the characters. Flynn and Dillinger's characters are fairly well established against each other, as are Dillinger's avatar Sark and the MCP in the computer world. Less clear and in conflict with themselves are Alan and Tron. Tron doesn't do much, this is not his story, and Alan in the real world only has a brief role to the point of being a set-up character that allows Flynn to do the stuff that he would otherwise find impossible, i.e. break into Encom, and even then it's Flynn that opens the door.
Now that is a big door.
Where does Tron/Alan stand in the character hierarchy? Well, below Dillinger, Flynn and the MCP for sure. He's talked up, but he's ultimately nothing more than the tool of the story to prompt or push the narrative forward as quickly as it can be done. He's less of a character than he is a convenience to the story progression. And his name is the title of the movie. Another character's hierarchy problem is to do with the Dillinger/Sark/MCP relationship. In the computer world, Sark is very much subservient to the MCP, where in the real world, Dillinger thinks he's in control until the MCP starts to blackmail him. It's confusing because it messes with the idea that the characters in the computer world reflect directly with those in the real world. Clue, for instance, is an embodiment of Flynn's hacking. Tron is Alan's security program embodied. Gibbs is the wise old man in the real world, a dispenser of wisdom. In the computer world, he's the I.O. port, and so on. Also, Dillinger is the user in the real world who's being usurped by the MCP, who has the villainous Sark as his henchman, Sark being played by the same actor that plays Dillinger. The parallels are awkward here and the story does falter. Is the MCP God here? Is he Dillinger's digital personality reflecting the corporate structure of Encom? If the MCP is God, then it's the case that God at one point had a user like every other program and is blackmailing his own former God. If the MCP is merely a usurper of his God, then what is the equivalent in the real world between Dillinger, the boss, and Flynn, the creative force? It doesn't really quite chime in. The man versus God analogy, the relationships between the characters, is all over the place. In some ways, the MCP does reflect certain fears of advancing tech, whilst maintaining an awe and wonder of it at the same time. But the story doesn't really touch much deeper than the surface level, and it leaves an awful lot to the viewer to glean. This is the problem with the story of Tron. It has heavy and thoughtful ideas, but it doesn't have time to really explore it. The aesthetics are what's primary here, though, at a heavy expense to the story, unfortunately. It looks astounding. The games are front and centre. The world has a very unusual and seriously alluring look to it. It captures the imagination. But the story, like I say, that's secondary. Very much so. It's all delivered in bursts of exposition, and considering the idea of the computer world was and still is very current, the story itself and even the things that go on in the film in terms of action are very old as written history. The gladiatorial games, the battle of good versus evil, man versus God, these are obviously classic story elements, simply brought into a modern fantasy setting. But it does very little more than bring it into the modern fantasy setting. It's very basic, almost to the point of redundancy. It's basic and clunky as hell, to the point that I can understand why it didn't engage the audience at the time, beyond the evocative world that it exists in. And when it comes to the crossover of themes from the computer world to the real world, well, the story is basically a copyright dispute. It's ironic that this is a Disney film, and in this world Disney would be Encom. Tron Legacy does go some way to fixing the problems that Tron had, but it too is very far from being perfect. What Legacy does right is that it frames much of what's going on in the story in a more human story. The absent father, the directionless son, along with an element of authoritarian control and perfection versus a more chaotic, but freer and more organic society that can challenge, change, and create. It can also explore the more philosophical questions of life. Legacy approaches these with various degrees of success. Where Tron presented the characters in the computer world more as avatars, Legacy has them more as artificial intelligence. This is a vital upgrade to the story if ever there was one, and it's notable how many of Legacy's characters have no real-world equivalent in comparison to Tron. I say upgrade not simply as a cute nod to the nature of the story, but because of what Legacy is, it's a reboot. Well, part reboot, a soft reboot if you will. It presents itself as a sequel, and to a great degree it works as such, but it really does lean heavily on Tron's beats to the point that we may as well be considering this a reboot. A side-by-side comparison may be in order. A computer hacker, disenfranchised from the company he works for, hacks its system. He's sucked into the computer world where he's mistaken for a program. The games are dreaded by the programs. He plays with an electronic death frisbee. Computer fascist and crony. He rides a light cycle and escapes from the arena with friendly programs. The heroes must race to the portal to escape. They do this on a barge for a while, until the barge is intercepted. Showdown at the portal between the computer fascist and the users. Return to the real world, complete with fellow programs. To be totally fair, Legacy does flesh these things out more than Tron did, but the bullet points of the film are near identical. But the additional aspects do make it a far more complete film in its own right. That's not to say that it does them particularly well though. Legacy suffers from many of the same issues that Tron did. There's a lot of style, I mean god it looks amazing. But again, it's a very old story. This could easily be reshot as The Matrix with very little change, and indeed it has an awful lot in common with that and other films in terms of aesthetics, themes and even scenes. The only thing that was unique to Tron, the original at the time, was its setting, and of course, how it was made. Legacy doesn't have that luxury though. Funny enough, I don't even damn Legacy for being largely unoriginal in relation to the film that it came from. With some 28 very unkind years between the original film and Legacy, it's pretty much a given that a sequel would have to reintroduce a new audience to its world. Visually, the cinematic world has progressed to the point that the original is, well, something of an anachronism. But kudos should be given to the fact that Disney didn't simply pull the full-on reboot lever and made an attempt to not only pick up a new audience, but to include the original fans rather than exclude or alienate them. Unfortunately, the film falls down in many of the same places that Tron did, with a story that is dominated by style over substance. While the themes are stronger, it's all buried under layers of retreading old ground, from the story out to the visuals. Both are old hat now. And then we come to the soundtrack. Now, I rather like Daft Punk, but the soundtrack to Legacy is incredibly domineering. It washes constantly over the film, feeling like it barely pauses, and often feels like it's muting the visual editing in terms of timing and pacing. The passage of time seems to become muddy because of the continuity of the music between shots and scenes, to the point that the film begins to feel like a music video rather than a film.
I'm stepping away for a moment, boys. Change the scheme, alter the mood. Electrify the boys and girls, if you'd be so kind.
Thank you.
Jem. My name is Jem.
Certain scenes where humour or emotion should act as a punctuation are lost in a haze of constant soundtrack. This moment where Flynn adjusts the security program by fonzing it needs a few beats of silence to land.
Identify yourself.
I'm taking this vehicle.
You are not authorized. Right away, sir.
This scene where a program is grieving over a fallen friend, a lover we don't know, but it's all emotionally lost in a gloopy sea of constant music. A few moments where the music changes to reflect the moment was all that was needed to allow that to sink in, that there's tragedy here. In this respect, the near seamless wall-to-wall Daft Punk music kills the movie's emotional impact. Surely this is movie music 101. You need to reflect and complement what's going on the screen. Daft Punk lends itself well to 2 to 4 minute tracks far better than it does a movie's entire soundtrack. In fact, the most ear-catching moments of the music happen in the arcade, before Sam is drawn into the computer world, where we hear 2 tracks from the original film's period-correct music. The most developed theme from the original isn't really done much justice here, if any. The idea of beings meeting their creators is bandied around occasionally with much the same frivolity that the original did. Flynn is God, Clue is the hubris-driven man, and Sam is the son of the creator. Yeah, he's essentially Jesus here. This would be fine enough, but it really goes nowhere like most of the thematic content. The best realised theme is that of parentage. The relationship between Clue and Flynn contrasts between Flynn and Sam, to some degree at least, and it raises some interesting questions and has a minor payoff in the finale. But again, it's not the main focus, and it's complicated by where Quora stands in the relationship, and that there is also very little conflict between Flynn and Sam in the story. The one moment of explicit conflict between these characters is a highlight of the film, but then the movie moves on with very little payoff, as the consequences of Sam's actions are resolved quickly and without consequence.
I'm sorry. I know I messed up. We can go back. I can go back.
No, we stay together.
Dad, I can do this.
You've done enough already! Sam, you're messing with my Zen thing, man.
All of the problems that the original had are barely addressed in Legacy. It all feels so breezy, and to some extent the film may have benefited from simply being an action film rather than raising questions and ideas that it has no intentions of seriously addressing. For instance, the situation between Encom and Sam, it could have gone somewhere, but it really doesn't. I'm honestly at a bit of a loss as to why this scene was even there, because they're not the bad guys in this film. They're just the corporate assholes that Sam has a jab at once in a while. It's more or less a throwaway piece of character establishment, which seems a little trite. If it seems a little elaborate to have all of this to set up part of Sam's character, it's because it's partly fan service, in that the son of Dillinger is there to continue to be the dick of the company. Other than that, Encom are in this movie in name only. They're a prize for Sam to win through following his character arc. The other things this story discusses occasionally fare a little better than Encom does in this story. There are allusions to AI in Quora and Clue, and they stand as a kind of allegory for their ruthless search for perfection. These don't really pay off, whether that's the opening of the film featuring the big bad from Tron, Encom. That's ultimately little more than fan service, or there's the nostalgia of Flynn's arcade and the old games within, or the nods to the original film.
Now that is a big door.
When it comes down to it, I do admire the attempt to link the old with the new, but it doesn't quite pan out in the bigger picture. The film just falls flat in the face of impressive but unsurprising production values, and the nostalgia is ultimately empty in the face of an entirely re-envisioned world and its populace. It's a fun enough ride, but it feels very much a rehash of an already flawed story, one that's been done 100 times, and most of those are better. A few performances stand out though. Jeff Bridges as Clue and Flynn were always going to be a dead cert for a good show. Less interesting is Sam, who, despite being performed reasonably well, is, well, he's something of a Mary Sue. He's just great at everything, arrives on the grid, instantly capable, and only stops short of being obnoxious overall because he does make some mistakes and he needs his friends and family to help him through. It ain't much, and frankly the same thing could be said about Flynn in the first film, but it doesn't help that flat feeling of the film that the hero is instantly confident and self-assured in the face of what would be a traumatically shocking change to the world surrounding him. I can accept it for Quora because she is part of the system, but Sam, and indeed Flynn in the original Tron, surely there should be some adjustment time. The other performances range from ordinary to pretty bizarre. Jarvis, Clue's chief henchman, is a rather leering but fun character, and Michael Sheen just hams it up spectacularly as Castor, seemingly channeling equal parts David Bowie and Jim Carrey's Riddler. Does this guy ever play anything like he's not performing to a very big auditorium? I don't know. Olivia Wilde does her thing, she's convincing enough, and though she doesn't stand out as much as some of the others, she does do a solid turn. Otherwise, it's largely background stuff, nothing offensively bad, but muted beneath showy visuals and that overwhelming soundtrack. So, how can I still look at Tron with such love, having said what I've just said? Well, for all my criticism of the story, I can't help but forgive the original Tron for its weaknesses. Why? Well, for one thing, it was a rather unique piece of filmmaking, especially for its time. It was an amalgam of new and old techniques and new approaches that presented some fresh challenges. It wasn't the kind of film that would easily lend itself to reshoots or adding in additional material given the production process. Quite apart from the problems of recalling actors, there were massive costs in time and money involved in creating additional footage that went beyond normal movie production. Tron had to be run to a very tight design. It was storyboarded to within an inch of its life. It was much more an animated feature than it was a live-action film, and it did feel like it was locked down from the start. It's like a first draft with all the problems that you would naturally get with that. Production began in 1976, inspired by the video games of the time, chiefly Pong. For those too young to know Pong, this is it. The genesis of Tron began with the notion of it being promotional material, and it evolved into being a backlit animation featuring live action and computer graphics, which was no small ambition back in the day. Eventually, it found a natural home in Disney, the only studio with the mindset to appreciate what it would take to make this film. Why would this be? Well, let's briefly look at the elements needed to make this film. First and most obviously, the computer graphics. These were very limited by today's standards and involved 4 companies chiefly: Information International, Robert Abel Associates, Digital Effects, and Magi, all of whom were assigned to different aspects of the animations, such as one company dealing with the modelling of geometrically based elements like the light bikes, and others working on more complicated things like the Solar Sailor. The backgrounds were largely done by hand by another company. Using computers with what by today's standards is an impossibly small capacity, reportedly 2 megabytes of memory and 339 megabytes of storage, the companies built these animations up frame by frame without the ability to have the computers actually run these animations. The resulting footage makes up some 15 to 20 minutes of the final film. Then there's the live action footage. Using a familiar single-colour soundstage, which is usually blue or green in most filming situations as a blank slate, proof-of-concept tests were instead shot against a plain white background, though this was quickly discarded when it was discovered that the logistics of the lighting would be a serious problem. Changing the state from white to black eliminated most of those problems in a heartbeat, while the actors were dressed in costumes that were black and white. A colour scheme that would provide a huge contrast with which the animators could more easily work. They were also shot on black and white film for the computer world footage. The challenge for the performers was enormous, as they were acting in a set that only existed in the most minimal way and responded to things that were simply not there. It's difficult enough for actors to work in this way today. Back in the early 80s, well, there just simply wasn't much precedence for this, and when it came to blocking the movement of the performers, it proved very difficult to match the movement on the stage to the world that had been built in the computer, with the live action performers doing things like jumping into chasms that are obvious in the final film but invisible to them and the crew. A big part of why I forgive some of the faltering of the acting is precisely because it was so new at the time. Acting at the best of times is an exercise in make-believe. Here, it was exponentially more so, something that for film actors in particular must have been a very odd and disorientating experience. The final one I'll touch on is the backlight animation. Backlight animation is a technique that involves using cells, in this case each frame of the live action filming, and additional animation, and rather than using reflected light, i.e. light from in front of the cell is lit from behind while using theatre gels for colour. The result of backlighting is that the image glows intensely because of the fact that the camera is actually looking at the light source. It's vivid, it's intense and striking. To achieve the final look, the multiple elements of the cell are lit differently, be it in intensity or colour, and so masks are used to isolate the components like the actors' faces, the costumes, the discs, the various parts of the set, all to create its final look. And when every element of the cell has been created, they're then overlaid on each other to create the final image. This was done for each and every frame of the computer world that wasn't entirely computer generated. The following sequence will give you a rough idea of what went into the backlight animation involved in this film. The task was so phenomenal, with anywhere between 12 to 50 passes being needed to composite the final shots. The background matte shots, made by hand, went through a similar process. By today's standards, the end results are rough. There are thick matte lines, the lack of colour photography for the characters' faces looks odd, though this could be considered a stylistic choice, and the computer world is very basic looking like what it is, an animation. There were problems with mismatched film stock which caused an issue with the brightness of the image to pop up and down, something that was dealt with by introducing additional animation elements that made it a feature rather than a bug. The world we were seeing was electronic, therefore it could glitch. It was creative thinking in the face of a very expensive problem. All said, it would be disingenuous to say this looks as good as it did back in the day. It has dated severely, but it's still all very striking and different, and it can't really be fairly judged by today's standards. This complex production was both very advanced and old school at the same time. The computer graphics, as dated as they are now, were groundbreaking and certainly underappreciated by the Academy at the time, who blocked the film from nomination because they felt it cheated by using computers. The truth is, they probably worked harder than anyone had ever before to achieve this film. While I obviously identify some serious issues with the story, I can't hold them against the film too hard. Tron was a magnificent and influential experience. Many a budding computer games creator made their own games inspired on Tron, and while Tron itself drew upon the games of its time, Ultra Tank, and Battlezone, Breakout, Space Invaders, Pong, this here is the Tomitronic 3D game Sky Attack, which came out a few years later. Looks very familiar, right? Bally Midway made the arcade game. Game devs have made many attempts since to recreate the excitement of the movie, with varying results. Blockade, most likely the origins of the light cycle idea, has had many iterations, and in my mind, when I play something like this, I always go back to the most memorable scene from Tron. Now let's compare this legacy of filmmaking history with the ironically named Tron Legacy. Aside from a couple of nice looking games which, as advanced as they are nothing new, and an animated series that's, well, a little unremarkable as pretty as it is, it's not really captured the imagination. That's not entirely its fault, considering how much the times have changed since the original Tron fired up the people's imagination in a time where the computer world was mysterious and new. Like I said, the story of Tron Legacy is better. Not by light years, but it does go further, and it tackles the ideas of the original a touch deeper, and lightly adds in some more current concerns. So why can't it be held in the same regard as Tron? Legacy, for one thing, will never hold the same sense of wonder, because it isn't of the time that Tron was. Given the advances in filmmaking technology and computer graphics, Legacy is missing the grand sense of fantasy that Tron had. Going back to that word, zeitgeist, it isn't a word I tend to bandy around. It can be a pretentious way of saying little more than it's dated. But what does the word zeitgeist mean? Essentially, it means spirit of the time, and one thing that can be said about Tron is that it was very much part of the zeitgeist of the early 80s. The wonder of the digital world was new and largely unexplored in the dramatic arts. That Tron died at the box office probably owes as much to its rather alien aesthetic and largely unknown use of computer language as its flawed story, but it persisted because it captured the imagination of a specific audience who appreciated the world that it portrayed, a world they were growing up with and building themselves. Tron married new technology with old techniques to produce something that was unique, where Legacy not only uses familiar filmmaking techniques, it goes back to far more conventional filmmaking techniques. The sets are real, the visuals are not that remarkable by today's standards, and the story is only a marginal improvement when it's not lifting from the original. Sure, it looks a million times better. It's neater, tidier, and shows some of the best of 2010 special effects. But it's nothing special. Aesthetically, it does have a distinct look, but in the world that has 1,000 films of great special effects, it barely stands out. The world it's based on is so familiar to everyone, with graphically sophisticated games being to a penny, that the very concept of Tron, with its now retro games, seems archaic before you even start. Basing the movie in the same things as the original was a big part of the problem. It's a time gone by that has little relevance to the computer world we live in today. Games these days are far more advanced, often featuring involved stories and choices, near cinematic interactivity, something that you don't get from a movie. Taking it forward as a story should have evolved with the times and used the wonder and anxieties of the modern computer world to tell a story. We live our lives on the internet, our personas are online. So much of our world is virtual to a point that there's an argument to be made for computer access being a human right. We as a society are struggling to deal with this, and on top of this, there are forces, governmental and otherwise, that seek to control us and our opinions through what we see and do online. And in Legacy, well, the concern is still stuck in the 80s, where we were wrapping our heads around what computers were. We're just not in that place anymore. Legacy just doesn't have the immediacy of Tron, and there's no reason why it couldn't have had that. Like Tron, it's a story that could have been told in a number of ways, and the world it inhabits is really not that important. So a mediocre story in a world that's flashy but not as impressive as its lower tech equivalent was in 1982. For all its faults, The Matrix used its computer world and the possibilities it presented to great effect. It was not just a venue for the story, it was integral to the story. With the original Tron, it was made at a time when we as a society were moving into that digital realm. The Matrix was also one of those milestones of cinema that helped define film to come in the same way that Tron did. And I ask, is there a single person who was really inspired by Legacy? Was it groundbreaking in any significant way? Was there a single thing that it did that hadn't been done before? Maybe the bridges bot, but I do remember being weirded out by that at the time. It's fun to watch, sure, but it just isn't remarkable in any significant way. It was hoped that Legacy would spark off a series of films and spin-offs, and in the run-up to it, that looked quite possible. But it didn't perform massively well. It made more than its budget of $170 million, backed by about $2 million domestically, while the worldwide takings punted it up to about $400 million. Hardly gangbusters, though better than the original, and saving it from being an official flop, but its future was more or less halted by a middling reception. As for Tron, it was an experience that held my imagination to this day, despite its box office failure at the time and despite the fact that it endured obvious aging. These days, it's certainly primitive looking. There's no getting away from the aged look of the movie, and that may well be an understandable turn-off for younger viewers used to the sophisticated CG of today. So as far as rebooting was concerned, it was certainly a wise decision from a commercial standpoint, and the fact that they gave enough of a crap to bother making it a sequel rather than a reboot is laudable. It's just a shame they didn't forward the story to mirror the current time more and use the opportunity to bring the story into the vastly changed world of computers and how we use them now. The things that could have been done in an updated Tron world would have been quite something. Also, as much as Tron was a surprisingly small character in the original, in the remake, he doesn't get much of a look in. He's pretty much fan service before he dies. It's almost a blink and you miss it nod to the original character, who's renamed for most of his time on screen, a reprogrammed version of his former self, and I think the name is barely mentioned. It's just a weird way to treat the titular character, and that's even bearing in mind how relatively insignificant he is in the original. Tron was a flawed tale, but it was one that was told in the most amazing way, and it's one that I'm only too happy to keep revisiting every so often. Legacy, well, the story was already outdated before it even shot the first frame. Despite the original's flaws, it has my understanding because of what it was. It was an audacious, ambitious and groundbreaking piece of filmmaking that was limited by the challenges. And it's a film that's difficult to course correct when problems arose. That's not to make excuses for Tron. It's not perfect by any means, but it did change the face of filmmaking. It made its mark and a permanent impression on a mind that had never seen anything quite like this at the time.